last night, gave the feature address at the inaugural Dennis Panton Memorial Lecture, so I want to welcome Carrie again. I wish to recognize all of our sponsor organizations, including the representative from Republic Bank Limited. Republic Bank is our exclusive financial sector. Yes, there she is. Our exclusive financial sector sponsor. I also want to recognize the chairman of the RIC as well as Mr. Glenn Kahn from the RIC and all of the sponsors who may be with us this morning. We want to thank you for your continued support of the Conference on the Economy. We're going to talk a bit more about our sponsors and the role that they've played in ensuring that our conference has maintained the high standard over the years. Without further ado, and in recognition of how valuable your time is, I wish to introduce our first session. As many of you may know, the Conference on the Economy is an annual event that we have in the department. It started in 2007. And this year, as you will see from your program, so posthumously the department is recognizing Professor Panton's contribution to the department and, of course, to the wider field of scholarship in the area of Caribbean economic development. And this morning's session effectively takes off from Professor Panton's work, and it begins by setting the stage for a review of the regional economy. As you will see from your program, we have three illustrious presenters who are going to speak with us this morning, and we have, for the first time, and I would want to break protocol in terms of introducing the members of the first panel, for the first time we have the ambassador from the conference, and we would like to say a very warm welcome to Ambassador Fernando Schmidt. Bienvenida a la universidad y a la conferencia, y gracias por su apoyo. We also have to Ambassador Smith's left, Dr. Dylan Alleyne, who is the Deputy Director of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, the sub-regional headquarters here in Port of Spain. Dylan left a career in academia to move over to the ECLAC, but he still maintains linkages with us at the university, and we always welcome him and the support that he provides for us. So welcome again, Dr. Alleyne. And to Dr. Alleyne's left, my colleague, Dr. Roger Hossain, Senior Lecturer in the Department of Economics. And the chair for this session is none other than Professor Patrick Watson, the Director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies here on the St. Augustine campus. As I said, you can look forward to a very interesting session, the opening session, which sets the stage and sets the tone. It looks at a review of the regional economy. ECLAC, of course, its purview, its remit is for Latin America and the Caribbean, so you're probably going to get that sort of panoramic overview. Dr. Hossain will focus a bit closer to home in terms of his presentation, and of course, Ambassador Schmidt is going to bring to us the Chilean perspective, so we get a really regional approach in terms of how we look at how economies are in fact performing. So without further ado, I pass the floor to the chair, Professor Watson, to take us through this first session.
Thank you very, very much, Marlene. You have already introduced the speakers, so I will simply tell you the order in which you'll go. Professor Alleyne will go first. I'm going to ask in one second, followed by Ambassador Schmidt, and followed by Roger Hossain. So we go straight into it, and yes, we go straight into it, and I'm going to invite Professor Alleyne, and I told him already he has 17 minutes, and I'll be warning them, so I'm not being rude when 5 minutes to go. I will tell each one of them, including His Excellency, that they have 5 minutes left, and then 2 minutes, and then I'll throw them off if they don't, they don't. So, Professor Alleyne, well, welcome, Professor.
It's wonderful to be invited to a session in honor of the distinguished Professor Dennis Panton, who I knew well when I was a young man. And, of course, to be in the presence of Professor Levitt, who taught me some years ago at the Consortium Graduate School at Mona. We're happy to be invited to these sessions. I've been asked to review the regional economies And given the presence of time, the pressure of time, I will focus on some key issues. My focus is largely on the Caribbean, except for Cuba and the Haiti and the Dominican Republic, which is normally monitored by our headquarters in Chile. I think to begin, let me identify what I would call some key issues which would be crucial in terms of how we go forward in the Caribbean. One is that it's important to understand that the global crisis, while it aggravated some of the economic and social conditions of the region, didn't cause it, that many of these challenges had a gestation long before the crisis. Secondly, I think the UN post-2015 agenda, which focuses on SDGs, are a welcome approach to development, and I think that the Caribbean may well benefit from this new thinking that development must go beyond mere per capita income to broader issues of sustainability. Thirdly, I want to argue that the problems that we face, which I will outline, are not problems that could be solved in a business as usual fashion. That these are deep structural problems, and I think some measure of industrial restructuring is required to address them. In this presentation, I hope to touch on growth prospects and outcomes in the last 5 or 6 years, regional unemployment, fiscal issues, monetary issues, the external sector. And then I'll talk briefly about the way ahead, how we might address some of these challenges in terms of our own thinking at ECLAC. When we look at the growth outcomes for the last 4 or 5 years, it's clear that 2 sets of trends are emerging. One, what I call the goods-producing economies of the Caribbean, specialist goods-producing economies. I'm talking here about Guyana, Suriname, to some extent Belize, and Trinidad and Tobago, have done fairly well, given the fact that some economies like Guyana and Suriname have grown in excess of 4% throughout the crisis period. And then you have what I call the specialist service producers. And as you see here, they have continued to struggle, partly because of the challenges in their external accounts due to decline in tourism, FDI, and financial services. So I think it's very important to disaggregate the information by goods and service producers. ECLAC believes that in 2014 and 2015, economic growth will be much better. But of course, we're talking about 2% in 2014 and 2.5% in 2015. And much of this will depend on what we call the reduced risk that we see emerging in Europe and the United States, our major markets. We were curious to know what the per capita income looked like over time for these groups of countries, the goods and the service producers. As you see, the graph on the right suggests the green line at the top shows you the service producers. Notice that the per capita income falls over a long historical period. And you see in the case of the goods producers some upturn, especially around 2000. And this has largely been what has been called the super cycle of commodity prices, which Latin America has benefited from. But this has a downside, because what it means is that these countries have become more reliant on primary commodities, what has been called the reprimatization of the region. On the right, we see the growth outcomes again, and you see the service producers are doing very badly. Low growth or poor growth performance is likely to be a to impact on employment or employment. And what we see here is unemployment rates going up for many countries. Unfortunately, in the Caribbean, we only have unemployment data for a few countries. But what data we have clearly suggests that the unemployment rates are going up. If you look at St. Lucia, which is the worst case from the point of view of the available data, you're talking about unemployment rates around 25, getting close to 25%. Interestingly, when you disaggregate the data by age structure, youth unemployment and the unemployment of women sometimes is twice the average rate, especially youth unemployment. And this is an ongoing concern with its implications for crime and so on. We now turn to some of the problems we observe in terms of fiscal policy. As you know, the Caribbean is saddled with a large debt burden. What we notice is that fiscal deficits continue to be large, and I would argue that while it is true that some of this fiscal challenge has been a function of negative external shocks, including damage and losses from hurricanes and so on, I think the issue of fiscal management has to be put on the table. Also in the Caribbean, given that these are small economies, the government is the employer of last resort and so is compelled to intervene, so that government spending tends to be pretty high. And the retrenchment, when it occurs, is much slower. The domestic private sector has emerged as very risk-averse in the post-crisis period, and the expansion of credit that we see is largely due to largely consumption-led. And so in the table here, you see the fiscal deficits, clearly much larger again for the service producers. And for the Caribbean as a whole, in the last year, the fiscal deficit, 2013, you see it's climbing, notwithstanding that several countries are engaged in fiscal consolidation programs, either under the IMF or, as in the case of Barbados, as homegrown policies. If you look at the composition of expenditure, and again, and we split this up by goods and service producers, what you observe is that current expenditure is pretty high as a share of total expenditure, which is very different from Latin America, where current expenditure tends to be much lower as a share of total expenditure. Interest payments are also pretty large, and capital expenditure, we notice, is being squeezed in the Caribbean. And this is where the adjustment takes place, which is unfortunate, given the potential of capital spending, both for growth through the capital stock and its complementarity with private spending. We noticed some increase in capital expenditure in the last year, and this is a good sign. But in general, capital expenditure has been squeezed. Public debt, which is a clear and present danger in the Caribbean, is pretty high in some countries, and in some cases unsustainable. Much of the evidence seemed to suggest, the econometric work seemed to suggest, that a debt to GDP ratio in excess of 50% begins to create a problem for growth. And what we notice in the Caribbean is that not only that the debt is large, but debt service is also significant. And we are trapped in this middle income status where concessional finance has dried up. Here on the left, we see a graph showing the fiscal balance and the total public debt for Caribbean countries. You see Jamaica is at the extreme there, St. Kitts and Nevis at the top, which what we notice there is that they are able to produce large primary surpluses, but because of the debt restructuring that they have been undergoing, but the debt burden is still very high, although it has come down. And most of the countries are bunched up in the middle there, making the point that their fiscal deficits are pretty large and the debt burden is also large. We were interested in seeing what was the level of fiscal space available to countries split up by service and goods producers. In other words, after you net out what I call obligated expenditures, what was left. And what the graph on the right suggests is that the fiscal flexibility for the service producers is much lower than that for the goods, than that of the goods producers. Not surprising. Of course, the composition of debt, not only the stock, but the composition is important. On the left, we see the debt split up by domestic and external by country. And on the right, we have the total debt by domestic and foreign. And what is clear is that the foreign debt component is pretty large, the external debt component in blue. And what it means is that these countries also foreign exchange risks. In other words, as a country devalues, the debt burden is likely to increase. So I have said before that debt service is pretty large, and in one case, the debt service as a share of revenue was some 57%. That clearly is a problem. And in 3 countries in the region, the debt service as a share of revenue has crossed the 30% threshold. I think also what we see in the adjustment that is taking place in the Caribbean, that there's not what we call, what ECLAC calls a social compact. In other words, an attempt to embrace all the social actors to address the problem. I think there are some elements of this in Jamaica through the MOU with the public sector, and Barbados in the tripartite system. Some elements in the OECS through their 8 points adjustment program. But in general, the point I'm making is that this constellation of forces designed to address the problem has not occurred, which is a problem. And I think that it's also important to recognize that the Petro-Carib agreement, which with Venezuela, also has been a source of recent debt increases. I have 5 minutes, so I have to move more quickly. In terms of monetary policy and inflation, we don't see anything significant there. Inflation rates have come down, and as I say, credit expansion has been more in the region of consumption-led growth. In terms of the external sector, naturally with problems in lack of robustness in tourism, tourist arrivals, remittance flows, and FDI, what we notice is that there are serious problems with the current account balance. And what it means is that foreign reserves are under pressure in some countries. And here, what we are looking at on the left is the current account balance, which is pretty large, although some adjustment has taken place in the last couple of years, but the adjustment is taking place at a lower level of output. And on the right, we look at the current account balance and the fiscal balance. And it tells the same story we've seen before. I want to take the last few minutes to talk about what I call deep-seated issues. I've said before that development aid is more difficult to come by. I think the model of development that is being pursued in the region based on factor endowments, whether it's tourism, beach, the beach and the sand, or whether it's bauxite and so on, I think that model is exhausted. I also think that unilateral fiscal consolidation, which is taking place in a number of countries, is affecting regional trade flows. And I think that combined with this is the so-called weak business environment. And this is complicated by the fact that we don't still address the issue of free movement of Caribbean people, which has an impact on the flexibility of local labor markets. If we look a little at the business environment, what is clear is that all the evidence suggests that relative to other small developing countries, and this is important, the Caribbean business environment is very difficult for business persons. And there are lots of things that keep coming up, corruption and so on, trade regulation, crime, limited access to finance, especially among small and medium-sized firms, and the difficulty of local firms to export. And on the right, you see the ease of doing business index. I thought it was curious to see Suriname, which is the worst example, and yet Suriname has had the highest growth in the last 5 years. It just shows you the challenge of looking at per capita income alone. I think there are two kinds of recommendations I want to make. One is that we have to pursue those measures for which large amounts of resources aren't required. Why? Because many of the governments are cash-strapped. Yes, thanks. So we must improve the business environment. And again, much of what is required sometimes is just institutional change. We also have to increase the efficiency of government spending and look at opportunities for public-private partnership. In the medium term, the diversification of markets and activities, the old problem raised by Bess and others, continues to be a problem. Not only of markets, but of activities. Then the building of technical capacity is very important. And I think this could only be done in these small economies at the regional level, or best done at the regional level. I think in the 1980s, the view was that you don't need to invest in technology and so on, because you could get it off the shelf. We've come to realize that that technology is important, even in terms of deciding on choice of technology, so that a local technical capacity is very important. We must remove the barriers to what I call joint production and cooperation, because much of the trade of firms these days is located within the context of global value chains, so that local interconnection becomes important. I wouldn't go through all the lists. I just want to say one or two points on this business of regional integration, which seem to have come off the radar in much of the discussion on development. I think that member states need to identify priorities and timelines. I think we know what some of the issues are, the so-called, what Norman Gorvan used to call the implementation deficits. I think debt reduction must be done at the regional level. Much of the discussion on debt is at the bilateral level. I think there are opportunities to approach the debt issue at a regional level. And there's an accompanying paper to these slides if some colleagues want to look at it. One last point I want to make is that I think that the regional markets we've come to realize is small, and there's a need for wider regional space. And the opportunities with Latin America are clearly there. A growing middle class with high incomes. And I think that what Suriname and Guyana are doing in terms of UNISUR and so on is really a good example for the rest of the Caribbean to follow. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.